I know I've talked about this in previous videos, but it's so important to the success of your story that it deserves to be talked about again. In this first part of my two-part series on narration, I will talk about how best to tell your story. It's no secret that an extremely important part of your novel is the narration. In fact, it's such an integral part of your story. Without it, you have no story. And that's because the narration of your story is the telling of your story. Without it, your story cannot be told. It would be like sitting amongst a group of your friends and after telling them you have a great story to tell about an amazing experience you had the night before, as they sat quietly around you, eager to hear your tale, you simply sat there smiling, reliving it only in your mind. It may be the most gripping and exciting story they might have heard in a long time. But if you don't tell it, narrate it, they will never know it. Time for another of my little tales. A young man running away from home is standing alongside a busy road hitchhiking when he is approached by an angel. The angel tells him he knows his mother and that her faithful work at the church has not gone unnoticed in heaven. As a show of their appreciation, this particular angel has come down to try to convince the young man to return home and make amends with his mother. But the young man was stubborn and refused to see the logic in returning home and so continued to try to flag down a car and ask for a ride. A short while later, a car stopped and offered the young man a ride. But before he got into the car, the angel told him that his decision to continue on his journey away from his mother was his own, but he would give him a warning that might save his life. Because the angel can see his future, he tells the young man that if he sits in the back seat behind the driver, a drunk driver will lose control of his truck and drive into the rear driver's side, which will result in the young man's sudden death. If he sits in the rear passenger side seat, the driver will lose control of the car, causing it to roll several times before ending up at the bottom of a hill, which will also result in the young man's death. And if he sits in the front passenger seat after driving behind a transport truck, one of the metal poles it will be carrying will come loose and fly in through the car's windshield, impaling the young man, killing him instantly. The young man thought about his fate at sitting in the different seats, all resulting in his death. He then thought about his mother and his reason for leaving. Then he smiled because he knew which seat he would sit in. Today, I'll talk about the importance of narrating your story. Then I'll tell you which seat the young man chose. To put it in textbook terms, narration is the telling of a story, and the narrator is the person, animal, or object who tells that story. I refer to a narrator as not only a person, but also an animal or an object, and that's because, depending on the story you are telling, the narrator is represented by one of these three. For example, the most common narrator is a person. Almost every story you will ever read will be narrated by a person, a man, a woman, or a child. But not all. There are times when a story is narrated by an animal. Narration by a horse, Black Beauty by Anna Sewell, one of the best-selling books of all time. Narration by a dog, The Call of the Wild by Jack London, which has remained in print since 1903. But there are also narrators that are neither people nor animals. The Collector by Tibor Fisher is narrated by a mysterious 5,000-year-old Sumerian bull. The Direction of the Road by Ursula Le Guin, narrated by a tree. Tiny Deaths by Robert Shearman, narrated by an ashtray. I guess what I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter who's telling the story. It must be told by someone or something. Let's first understand what a story is. You're probably thinking everyone knows what a story is, and you're probably right. Everyone most likely knows what a story is. The textbook term is a narrative, either true or fictitious, in prose or verse, designed to interest, amuse, or instruct the hearer or reader. Notice how the first part of that textbook term is the word narrative. Now, hopefully, you're beginning to understand why the narrative is so important. Since the narrative is the telling of a story, it stands to reason that it is the story. And we find narration in anything where we want to impart some type of information onto others. And this holds true for plays, short stories, poems, novels, jokes, news reports, TV or radio ads, commentary, and so on. When was the last time you picked up a newspaper and read the lead story on the front page? Maybe it went a little like this. A little before 5 a.m. yesterday, while many of us were tucked away safely in our beds, a sole pedestrian, a young woman in her 20s, who had just gotten off the 4:45 bus, the same bus she was accustomed to taking each night from work, was struck by a drunk driver while crossing the street mere steps from her home. How about a commentary in a magazine? Although it's been an entire week since that fateful night, when a man who put more importance in the bottle he was drinking from than the young woman he struck and killed outside of her home, this city is still feeling the loss of such a promising young medical intern. At the burial site of Cynthia Jones, her mother, unable to withstand the pressures of grief that came with saying goodbye one last time to her only child, fell to her knees and with her hands outstretched above her head, shouted out the question that we all were secretly asking: why this child? How about a joke? A young woman is rushed to hospital after being hit by a drunk driver. After being placed in the ambulance, she ends up at the hospital where she interns. "Oh my goodness," said the attending physician. "Cynthia, what happened?" "You left here less than an hour ago." "I was hit by a drunk driver," she answers. "But I was wondering, since I'll be here for a few days, do you think they'll let me apply the hours to my internship? I'd hate to let my time here go to waste." How about a good novel? With the absence of the moon, even the roads seemed darker than usual. The row of neighborhood houses, shrouded in darkness, reflected a feeling of melancholy as they sat quietly overlooking it. The sound of the 4:45 bus in the distance could be heard growing stronger until it turned onto the road that suddenly became bright with its series of lights. Like clockwork, it stopped across from a familiar house and waited while a single passenger disembarked. "Thanks, Carl," she said. "See you tomorrow night." As the bus pulled away and taking with it the noise and light it had interjected into the quiet and its darkness, Cynthia looked across at her home. A single light on the second floor was lit, her mother's bedroom. She had difficulty sleeping until her daughter was safely inside. Suddenly, as Cynthia stepped onto the road, a car, being driven erratically and far too quickly for such a quiet neighborhood, raced past her home. It happened so quickly she hadn't the chance to make it back onto the sidewalk before the car collided with her, lifting her up and catapulting her onto the opposite sidewalk, steps from her front door. As you have probably realized, I've just given you a few examples of narration. And the important thing to understand is without the narration, none of these could exist. Because, like I said before, narration is the telling of your story. Therefore, the narration is your story. If you remember from some of my earlier videos on writing a novel where I talked about plot, characters, setting, conflict, climax, and denouement, you'll remember that these elements together create a story. And now we know narration is the story. Therefore, these key elements owe their existence to the narration because without it, they cannot be brought to life. Think about it this way. If the plot of a story is the roadmap, allowing the reader to understand what your story is about and the direction it takes, then how do you communicate that understanding to your readers? They don't suddenly have an epiphany. They depend on you with a thought provoking, descriptive manner to guide them through it. If your story is about a young woman struck down in the prime of her life by a drunk driver and her mother's quest to track down that driver to finally bring to him her brand of justice, it is delivered to your readers through narration. Unlike watching a movie where we can sit back and watch a story unfold before our eyes, a novel cannot depend on visuals. It requires the author's unique rendering of it. It's easy to sit back in a comfortable chair and watch as the camera pans over the landscape of a downtown neighborhood. Every intricate detail is displayed and depicted in mere seconds. That's because through the eyes, the brain can absorb a great deal of information in a relatively short period of time. Hence the term, a picture is worth 1,000 words. But if you, the author, want to leave your readers with an impression of a setting so vibrant they can easily imagine it in their mind, you must rely on your ability to narrate it. Here's a bit of an example of what I mean. It was just a little after 7, but the heat had already begun to initiate the stench from a row of industrial garbage bins waiting for pickup along the narrow laneway next to the hospital. A group of fifth graders, as they waited for their school bus, took noticeable enjoyment at watching the local homeless man who put on a little dance show for them. A man dressed in a business suit flags down a passing cab with his morning paper, and a woman, pushing her stroller, holds her nose as she hurries across the laneway. From the second floor of the apartment complex adjacent to the hospital, a mother calls down to her son, reminding him to come straight home after school because she cannot be late for work 2 days in a row. The combined reverberation of stopped vehicles at a red light, part of a street filled with motorists impatiently endeavor to make their way through their morning commute. Exhaust fumes bellowing up out from several city trucks, and the sound of an ambulance is heard as it weaves in and out of traffic to come to a full stop at the emergency entrance of the hospital. Now, short of an actual photo or drawing in your novel, it's impossible to give your reader a sense of this setting without narration. And good narration can help your reader to picture it in their mind. I have said many times before that your main character is the single most important part of your story. And that's because your story is about taking your main character on a journey where they emerge better than when they began. Your readers want to know how they accomplish this. They want to follow them on their quest and see them emerge on the other side, having accomplished that which they set out for. Here's another little example. Dorothy Jones had never been the same since she lost her husband to an unnecessary attack several years earlier. The thugs that took away her one true love not only destroyed her life, but robbed her teenage daughter of a loving and caring father. Since that fateful night, she has been very protective of her daughter, smothering her at times, even impeding her ability to mature into a contributing member of society. But she couldn't help herself. Her daughter was all she had left in the world and her only reason for believing in a better future. When Cynthia got accepted into the medical training program, it was a bittersweet time for Dorothy. Yeah, she was overjoyed that her little girl was one of only 3 applicants accepted. But this also meant that her daughter would be spending more time at the hospital outside of her protection. Her life, as she knew it, ended the night she watched her daughter being run over by a drunk driver. Although she was a petite woman, standing no more than 5 feet 2 inches tall, the moment she said goodbye at the gravesite for the last time, she knew that it was up to her to locate her daughter's killer and make him pay. You see, it's through an author's ability to narrate that we know and understand the characters in a story. Your readers cannot see them, so you need to describe them in such a way they seem to jump off the page into their mind. That description is relayed through narration. Even the conflict of a story cannot continually build suspense as it's meant to if it's not conveyed to the reader by way of narration. Here's a little more. Just when Dorothy thought she was getting through to the police, they informed her that nothing she had brought them was any more than her word against his. His girlfriend swore that they were together that night until late the next morning, and she was willing to stand up in court and swear to it. There was no question in Dorothy's mind that his girlfriend was lying. She just wasn't sure if she was lying out of a misguided sense of loyalty or out of fear. Whatever her reason, it didn't matter. She was helping to allow a guilty man, the man who took away her little girl, to remain free. She had merely wanted to have a little chat with his girlfriend and record her admitting she was lying. But the meeting didn't go as planned. It was probably seeing his girlfriend laugh in her face as she admitted she knew he did it that caused her to pick up the vase and bring it down onto her head. To her relief, she hadn't killed her, only rendered her unconscious. She could have found herself facing murder charges, but instead turned the situation to her advantage. She would leave her there on the floor of their apartment. She would also take the recording of the girlfriend admitting they were not together that night, so her boyfriend, her daughter's killer, would be sure to come after it. And when he did, she would be ready for him. She knew that the moment he turned and saw her standing there, that she had made a grave mistake. She hadn't thought her plan through. If she had, she wouldn't have tried to confront him in such a secluded place. She was trapped inside her house with a killer, and he was blocking the only exit. He knew she lived there alone. That's why he took the bait and agreed to meet. Her mistake was she was the only witness to her daughter's death, and he knew it. That, along with his girlfriend's taped confession, made her 2 things to him: a real liability and a good reason to make sure she nor the recording saw the outside of that house again. The severity of her decision didn't become real until she tried running for her bedroom door and felt the strong grip of his hand at the back of her neck. Yanking her toward him, she tried to scream as she felt her body slam into his about the time His other hand clamped down on her mouth, muffling any cries for help she had intended. But somehow, after he had turned her around to face him, she managed to drive her knee into his groin area. Mm. When he dropped to the floor, she grabbed the recorder from the night table and ran for the door. It wasn't long before he was up and after her, taking one step for each two of hers. Several times he came close to grabbing hold of her, and a couple of times he was able to slam her tiny frame into a nearby wall. But she didn't give up and, still clutching the recorder, made her way to the front door and outside. By the time they both made it onto the sidewalk, he was close enough to reach out and grab her. She knew it would be just a matter of time before he finally caught her and then dragged her back inside. At that time of night, the street was empty. Everyone was sleeping. No one would arrive in time to rescue her. Then, to save herself, she ran into the street, just as the 4:45 bus was passing her house. At the last possible moment, she lunged for the other side, making it to the sidewalk just as her daughter's killer reached out for her, but ended up being struck dead by the bus. Through effective narration, an author can bring a reader to the edge of their seat as they read each word that brings them and then keeps them on this climb, while filling their mind with visuals, allowing them to realize the intensity of the climactic finish. Then, to bring all of this to a close, it's time to narrate the denouement, the ending, that brings a conclusion to your main character's quest. By the time the bus had screeched to a stop, Dorothy had gotten back to her feet and was staring down at the body of her daughter's killer. She had fulfilled the promise she made to her daughter at the gravesite. She had made him pay for what he had done. At that moment, she felt a great burden lifted, allowing her to finally breathe a sigh of relief. Looking down at the recorder still in her hand, she knew that although he had escaped prison, his girlfriend wouldn't. And as the driver of the 4:45 bus, the one who brought her daughter home safely each night, had unintentionally helped in making her killer pay. Bringing your story to a satisfying close can only be accomplished by way of narration, allowing your reader to see through carefully chosen wording the impact and the ending of your story. And now, the ending to the story I call The Only Choice. Since the young man knew that whichever of those seats he chose would result in his death, he did the only thing he believed he could do. Realizing that he just wasn't ready for life traveling on such a dangerous road, he asked the driver if he could sit in his seat and drive the car. When the owner of the car said yes, he got in, turned the car around, and drove back home to his mother. In my next video, I'll cover part 2 of this series on narration, titled The Written Power of Narration. Thanks for watching, and if you found anything that I said beneficial to you in any way, hit that subscribe button, because you never know, my next video might just be helpful too.